I'm really pleased that for today's In Conversation With, I'm joined by Dr. Carolyn Cooke. Carolyn has worked as a secondary school music teacher. She's been a head of music, lecturer in education at the Open University, and as a tutor for Aberdeen and Edinburgh University. She currently works for the Open University in Scotland on early childhood and primary education courses. She has written on a range of music education topics and has recently completed her PhD, Troubling Music Education, Playing, Remaking and Researching Differently. Carolyn is actively writing and presenting in the areas of STEAM education, transdisciplinarity, performativity in research and posthumanism. It is my great pleasure to welcome her today, and thank you so much, Carolyn, for joining me for this In Conversation With.
No problem.
So, one of the kind of main reasons that I really wanted to talk to you, Carolyn, well, there's a multitude of reasons actually. One, because of your theorizations and perspectives on posthumanism, but also that you played quite a central role in the BERA Commission for STEAM education. So you have really quite a broad kind of understanding of STEAM education from a multitude of different perspectives that came out of the BERA Commission. But then your own research as well has kind of gone down this kind of post-human lens, which now I think might offer a really interesting insight on STEAM education. So there were two kind of main reasons that I was really excited and really wanted to speak to you for one of these In Conversation With. So my first question for you, Carolyn, is what is the role of the A in STEAM from your perspective?
So it's really interesting. I was receiving sort of thinking about these questions and what we might be talking about today has made me really sort of take a step back a little bit about my role in the BERA STEAM project, because actually it feels like a absolutely lifetime ago in many respects. So much has happened between now and then, and it really made me reconnect with the term, because actually it's a term that I'm not currently using very often in regards to my own work. It is very much part of my role in that project as a research assistant, but for me the term is problematic, and so I have moved away from it. So the reason that I feel it's problematic is partly a response to what we wrote about in the BERA Commission. That for me, the adding of the A to STEM, it hasn't necessarily in all cases had that kind of generative weaving effect where the A meets and encounters and is interacting with the rest of the term. But actually, ironically somewhat, that the A can act as a bit of an othering, that it's adding something different into a mix. It's being inserted and as if it wasn't already present. And that is a bit difficult for me now, because I see, I've moved on to the word transdisciplinarity instead. So that's where my kind of language has moved away. And in some ways, that's a reaction to this idea that the arts are somehow only there if the A is inserted into the term. Whereas I see the arts as absolutely threaded. It might not be verbalized very often, it might not be explicitly narrated as being there, but it absolutely is across, between, in, through everything. It's just how we perceive it and how we kind of consider it. So there was this whole narrative from the BERA Commission about avoiding A being used as a handmaiden to STEM, and the idea that we use the arts to somehow make STEM more accessible, more diverse, more enjoyable, more entertaining, more engaging. And that story of A as separate seems, it has a tension within it. Mm-hmm. So transdisciplinarity is much closer to where my research and practice has gone. And I, for instance, I've worked with the idea of improvising in education. And yes, I come from a music education background, a music background, so improvising within music was very rooted. But I didn't, although we explored the term through theatre and through art and through sort of physical play and through nature in terms of theme and variation, none of that was preordained. It wasn't that I said, I'm going to take a bit of this, plus a bit of this, plus a bit of this, and the result will be this kind of conglomeration. It was much more, I'm going to start here and we're going to push outwards and we're going to see where it goes. And whatever we come into contact with, whatever we encounter on the way, then creates the situation in which something different might occur as a result. So it's not moving away from the disciplines, it's not destructive, and it's not saying that arts don't have a unique contribution to play, but it's what can this mashup, this kind of composting of all these different ideas bring to a situation, rather than something being inserted. So yeah, that's where I'm at with the term at the moment.
I think that's really interesting. The arts in general are othered quite considerably. You work in kind of early years, primary education, experience secondary education, my background secondary. So the othering of the arts is so prominent now in terms of the English baccalaureate, performative and assessment regimes that push the arts out of the way in school timetables. So there are real issues in this notions of the arts being othered. So I think it's really interesting that even having a term like STEM, they're moving it to STEAM to try and add the A back in. But are there other subjects who are then not part of that acronym that actually then are also othered? So this notion of transdisciplinarity, I think, potentially really opens up the space of what curriculum, what education could possibly be. And I really like that you just said that you said that we can start to look outward and experience other encounters that potentially might not have been planned for by a teacher, for example. How or if can that be operationalized in a classroom or in the HE environment?
Yeah. I think that is a really interesting question. And I suppose a lot of my PhD work stemmed from my personal experiences of being a mother of early, young children, pre-verbal at the time that I was kind of formulating the project. And then subsequently my experience of them and their experiences in primary, and obviously my own work in primary and early years. And I see it all the time. But what I'm not, when I say I see it, I'm not saying that I see something that other people would, in the education world, would label as transdisciplinarity. They wouldn't use that language. What they see is something that is exploratory, is experiential, is very much led by the children as they move around and they combine materials from different boxes and make a big mess on the floor, and all of that kind of stuff. And so thinking about that and coming from that place where it's not about us setting out a timetable that allows this subject to meet this subject and putting them together. What it's about is an attitude, I think. It's about a disposition to what it means to learn in this very exploratory, transdisciplinary way. And I feel like I've had to learn that myself. I've had to change how I am from my music education background to be different as a researcher, and different in my own practice and in my own writing. And some of these differences, posthumanism gives us the language to help us describe what those differences are. So a key difference for me is the idea of being response-able, with the hyphen between response and able. And the idea of having response ability, the ability to respond in the moment, the ability to respond to encounters that maybe set us off in a different direction than we were expecting, or the ability to be response able to manage our own vulnerability to be able to take a different course than we'd planned, that's one massive part, I would say, of being kind of in this space. That's incredibly challenging when it's put with the narratives of teacher in control, you know, teacher at the front of the class, teacher is planning in linear ways to make sure that you get children from A plan to the end B outcome. So that's one thing. And part of that responsibility is being attentive and being super aware, paying real attention to what is going on in that particular moment in time. And so this isn't just a paying attention as in listening for a verbal confirmation of what's happening. It's not even a paying attention to the processes that are happening. What I've really had to focus on, and this again came from playing with my own young children, it's that attentiveness to emotional response, it's that attentiveness to body, physical movement, it's that attentiveness to what, you know, questions like, what is the material doing in this relationship? So, you know, watching young children play with blocks or teddies or, you know, whatever it might be, spoons on a saucepan, you know, what is the material? What are those objects, those materials, those things doing in that relationship? And that's a particular type of attentionality that you have to kind of embrace, and is so productive. So in my research, that made me pay attention to what the lesson plan format was doing to with my music student teachers that were involved in the project. The way that it wasn't that we explicitly looked at a lesson planning format together, but they talked about planning, the processes of planning, the form, the power relationships within it, the way that the boxes focused their attention on certain aspects of teaching. It did something, it was a doing, and that you know, that, so attentiveness to those doings is really important. And then the final one is, these are all interlinked, they're all kind of mishmashed together, but being minor is not an easy thing for someone that's come through a teacher education process. Actually being able to sort of step back and realize that, you know, it's challenging that human exceptionalism thing, and realizing just how entangled, reliant, responsive we are to everything within an entanglement, materials, humans, stories, verbalized, you know, texts, all of these things do stuff to us, and we are just part of it. We're part of the meshwork. So being able to step back and kind of reposition ourselves. I've totally lost what the beginning of the question was, Victoria. but it's dispositions for me. It's how you are.
I think the three key things that you've talked about there are really important, because the starting point for this project is my interest in the fact that from early years right the way through to higher education, that there's a difference in kind of offerings to young people. You're kind of right in the sense that my experience and readings around early childhood education is that they are offered opportunities to experience everything within their environment. There is some definitions between subjects, mathematics and literacy, but it feels more transdisciplinarity. There's more of that going on within the space. And as you move into primary and secondary, we are taught into these sort of processes of doing a particular subject, working towards specific outcomes. A teacher plan, a lesson plan, you're so right. I haven't even thought about that, but the very way that they are designed, that the outcomes are often usually in boxes, you know, that a teacher must follow, that the children must follow on the board. So there are expected outcomes for them to reach. And then, you know, as part of this is a STEAM House fellowship. So there's the new STEAM House building that is, you know, going to be open soon. And actually the spaces that have been designed for that do offer up a lot of those openings that you're talking about. Spaces are not necessarily closed up, but there is that reach and space for, you different professionals, different age ranges, to all start to collaborate with one another. But there is something in what you're saying, that to be response able, to be attentive, to step back, you do, as a teacher, have to reposition yourself and accept to exist within the messy, to accept for things not to go right. But that in itself is an important learning process for everybody involved.
And I would add to that, sorry to jump in, I would add to that it's on the lesson planning forms, having worked across multiple institutions, it's always the same. Resources, which is the material bit of the lesson, is a box. And those resources are often described of how are you going to use them. And it's human control over those resources, making them do what we want them to do to get to a particular outcome. So when you say about being responsive to what might not go right, there's also a sense of what happens when we give children a composition brief and a set of instruments in a particular location, in a particular practice room, in a particular time of the day, the week, the calendar year, and how far do we sort of limit the boundaries? So even within a discipline, as originally defined, there are opportunities to let materials open up possibilities that are, as you're saying, unplanned, unexpected, but that's a very vulnerable position. But actually, it's a much more, I hesitate to use the word authentic, but it feels a much more genuinely making with each other position. So, we talk so much about pupil voice, but actually pupils having the right, children, young people, teachers having the right to make with materials in different ways that they want to do things, actually it's all part of that empowering debate, that kind of non-hierarchical relational sort of stuff that we all kind of talk the talk of, but maybe we don't necessarily live. I don't know, that's very much
I think then what's interesting is that then when students, if they go into higher education, further education, into work, by not teaching in that way, are we somehow restricting them? Do they come out? Are we hand-holding too much and not allowing this kind of collaborative, creative sort of process, post-human, to, relate to the environment, relate to our kind of home lives? I question this a lot when I think about a space like STEAM House. That, our students at BCU are going to also be part of the STEAM House building, the working. Do they know how to work in this way? Have they had those experiences to be able to work in a transdisciplinarity way? And actually the role of primary, secondary education is to offer those opportunities, and there's the potential that we're not offering those opportunities, and therefore do we just have an education system that suits few people and not everybody?
And it's self-propelling, isn't it? Because as researchers in universities, we're constantly talking about interdisciplinarity and kind of how can we do projects together, and this is highly valued within our institutions, and we're saying in early years this is happening really successfully in many cases, and then there's this gap in the middle, and in that gap we have all of those systems in place that with the best will in the world push us all, they are doing to us the work of keeping us in those silos. I think there's really, I would love to have the time and support resources to explore how the pandemic has shifted some of this. I find it interesting talking to young people at the minute who've gone through that period of homeschooling where all the disciplines were, not necessarily, they were working in one physical space, one physical environment across all disciplines, with very similar material resources. And I'm not sure whether, that has had an impact on how the disciplines are seen. Maybe the virtual world of these children's experiences has still separated things into very distinct disciplinary sort of blocks that aren't interconnected in any way. But I think that there's something interesting happened over the last year in relation to this. Whether it's, the other thing I keep thinking about is how many families created kind of journals or kind of scrapbooks of images, or even on their mobile phones, of kind of images of children doing homeschooling in whatever way, and what they valued as homeschooling experiences. I think that's really interesting. What did they see the learning? We've all had to stay with the trouble. We've all had to be response able to a completely different turn of events. And so it's interesting to me, has that changed perceptions of what learning counts and what learning is? I don't know. That would be fascinating.
It would be. I think with the pandemic, and obviously in the UK, young people have gone back into school now. They are still in their bubbles. But I do think that there's potential opportunity now to forward think about what education could be and how it could look like. We haven't had the kind of typical exams that, have gone before. This will be the second year now. So there is a real opportunity to rethink the way that we do things. The way even that the young people have moved around a school environment has been so different. Absolutely. So again, kind of going back to that kind of transdisciplinarity, there is potentials now to even rethink how you go about moving from subject area. Do they remain in one sort of classroom where they can interact with one another? There's just a real possibility post-pandemic to rethink things. My worry is that there will be too much focus on this notion of catch up, and that we will lose the kind of creativeness that possibly could come out of, a potential happy kind of coincidence of the pandemic is that we could really rethink education, but there might be this catch-up notion that will even other the subjects even further into core subjects and other subjects.
Absolutely. I can see that happening in practice. Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right.
So from your experience, what did your kind of participants or students or learners experience through this kind of ways of working, the post-human ways of working that you explored in your PhD thesis? What did that offer them?
I think so much of my thinking about my project comes back to one quote from Donna Haraway, which is this: "It matters what stories we tell other stories with, and it matters what stories we make worlds with." That's not a direct verbatim quote, but that's the basis of it. And for me, this idea that we explored improvising through lots and lots and lots of different avenues, and we felt things together, we made things together. It did begin to change the story of what it meant to be a teacher. Not, it wasn't a measurable thing. I didn't kind of do a pre and post, measure of how things had changed. But there were conversations, there were things that they made, images they created, ideas that they had about being a teacher, that it wouldn't have occurred, it wouldn't have come up, it wouldn't have manifested itself in our discussions. And it was interesting because, as well as it was complicated, because I was doing this project, but I was also tutoring them alongside. So I did go and do school visits for assessment purposes, separate in inverted commas from my project. But the number of them that talked to me about teaching as improvisatory when I went and visited them, even though I'd had the discussions about the fact that we weren't going to be using the school visits as part of the project. So there was this kind of this bleeding out, this kind of rhizomatic kind of spreading out of ideas around improvisation and teaching as improvisation that had become it was woven into their experiences and my experience. You know, it wasn't project as a container. This was definitely not. This was definitely all of us feeling and bringing in experiences that wouldn't necessarily have been considered part of a music education project. So in that way, I think that it did have impact, however you define that. It did create, it made, that's the word, not impact, it made differences which were evident. And yeah, so that's how it kind of came about, I suppose.
So I had some questions planned, but I actually think that we've gone in a completely different direction, because a lot of them were focused on the notion of STEAM, which you very rightly have said, actually, we're going to push that notion of STEAM to one side. Yeah. And we're going to focus on this notion of transdisciplinarity. Why do you think that is important for the 21st century, or is it important?
I think we can just see examples everywhere of transdisciplinarity, and I mean, you know, obviously the pandemic is very front and center of our minds at the moment, but we can see it, you know, that it has been a completely collective moment between every discipline, you know, understanding the history, understanding the biological medical sciences, understanding the role of the arts in motivating, in bringing us together, in helping key organisations explain and reach key communities to understand what's going on. You know, it's been a moment where our selves, our embodied selves, our lived experience have all shifted, and we've had to be vulnerable, we've had to be responsible. So for me, there's a lot of evidence at the moment of how this kind of way of thinking with the world and with the material world, with nature, where, you know, where these silos have been, you know, very dramatically, you know, broken, and we've had to learn to be different, and that's the core. It's how can we live differently, how can we act differently, what sort of different relationships we need to have. So that's where I think it is. I think that's what, if we carry on preparing our young people in old habits, then that's not setting them up well for dealing with the unexpected, the vulnerables, the complex, you know, all of those things that we've talked about.
That's really powerful to think about that. I mean, one of the questions that I had was, you know, what's the distinctive or characterizing role of the arts? What do you think are there any commonalities between subjects in order for them to be able to interact with one another? So are there any commonalities? There are obviously differences that each subject brings with it. Yeah. But what is it that brings them together somehow?
So I think that's fascinating. And I've worked with a colleague, well, my supervisor, Laura Colucci-Gray, comes from a science education background. And talking with her and reading literatures together around this kind of area, you know, so much of science is and other disciplines are about that storytelling, those narratives, the ways that we you know, the intersections between arts and sciences, right back, you know, Da Vinci and you know, pre-Enlightenment, where it was through the combination of arts and sciences that knowledge was deemed valuable, was understood, was reported, was shared. And for me, when Laura and I talk, and other colleagues as well, that where we're talking between and across disciplines, those very same things come up. It's about, nothing happens without that vulnerability, that ability to go with something, to see something, that's maybe in the moment, something that's a bit different, which may not be the majority view, which might be something that's actually quite minor, but actually sparks something incredibly productive and generative. And it's those moments that I think, if we can change how we are and how we relate with each other, that cuts across everything, I think.
Now, you've spoken a lot about post-humanism, and the post-human turn has kind of really shifted what's possible in kind of research and methodology. Can you tell me a little bit more about your perspective of what post-humanism could possibly do for research within this area? What does it offer that potentially traditional research approaches haven't done before?
Yeah, and I think that comes, this is very, very cyclical, because this comes back to that shifting stories and shifting how we are. Because my PhD project didn't start out as a post-humanist PhD project. That wasn't the words that I was using. It wasn't the language or the literatures that I was exploring at the time. I came to it, and in reading, in listening to videoed interviews, in talking with others that are working in this area, it has, I wouldn't say it's completely shifted, because there must have been things in how I was interacting with the world that was already moving in this direction. But certainly it gave it created the possibilities for me to follow these particular lines that I wouldn't have otherwise followed. So the particular things that it allowed me to do was to get off that sort of pedestal of human exceptionalism, that re-seeing the world where we are interacting with materials, other bodies, environments in a more equal fashion, and where each of those can do something differently. And for me, that's hugely exciting in research, particularly educational research, and particularly music education, actually, where we are in music education is such a materially rich subject. And yet we spend so little time thinking about what the piano in the corner of the room next to the teacher's desk does, or what the cupboard full of instruments for the children that play that have peripatetic lessons does to children that aren't having peripatetic lessons, or all of these things. But also for music education, I think it has a real power in bringing the sound back in, because so much of music education research leaves out discussions of what the sound does. And posthumanism, as part of this idea that everything is constantly moving and everything is constantly pushing out. I mean, diffraction is a key metaphor for posthumanists and a key kind of way of working. And diffraction of sound is a key physical phenomena in music. So there's lots and lots of ways in which we can use posthumanism to re-sound music education. Think about what the sound does. Think about the role of sound in our classrooms. Think about the role of music within our research. And that's not easy. That changes what research is, how it's presented, particularly at a PhD level. So it asks some really, really big questions.
Fascinating. I mean, when we then bring that back into classroom interactions, I was thinking then about one of these other In Conversations With that I've done with one of a colleague at BCU who's also kind of worked on the architecture design for the new Steam House building. And we were talking about, the architecture of the classroom space and, how everything's kind of spread out into the corners, how you're talking about a music education classroom with, instruments closed up in the cupboard, the piano right next to the teacher's desk. But really what we're talking about here is, this is on a very minor, lower level, very layman's kind of term of describing what you've talked about. But it is about starting to notice more than what we potentially have noticed before.
Yeah.
The movements of the young people or our students within the classroom, the sounds that we produce, the way that we offer up spaces of learning, the types of possibilities that we offer them within the classroom, rather than being bounded by closed off opportunities, a closed cupboard. That actually we start to pay attention. I think that's what I've got a lot from this conversation, is the need for educators to pay attention, the need for the notions of things like STEAM to go beyond science, technology, engineering, the arts, mathematics, and to see things on a wider level, things that can, as you say, interact with one another.
Absolutely. And music can be really valuable in that space, because by its very nature of sound pushing outwards, and we send sound waves out, we need to maybe, some of the stuff I've done with student teachers in the past has been about leaving the music room, of actually going and playing, listening, experiencing sound beyond the music education kind of walls. I did a listening walk with student teachers where it was very much that. It was about reconceptualizing, helping us think with environmental sounds and what they could do to our perceptions of music and music listening in the classroom. So this idea, I love the idea of bringing it with the architecture, that sound matters to architects. It matters to scientists who are doing experiments, and the sound actually helps them understand what's going on. It matters, and so the mattering of sound, I think, is paying attention to that. It's got a lot of potential,
And I think, obviously we've spoken about sound, and you mentioned sound, obviously, with the background, the music background that you come from. But really what an education should do is kind of represent all the senses.
Absolutely.
And offer that experience within the classroom. And I think that's probably what a post-human lens allows us to start to consider. It is the more than human. It is the interactions that we have all around us, not just the human. You've left me with so many things to ponder and so many things to unpick, but it's been a really fascinating conversation, and I think a new perspective, actually, with other discussions that I've had. I think it's been quite interesting that I've done quite a number of these discussions now, and speaking with you, it starts to unpick some of the really important things that we need to think about in terms of, is it STEAM? Is that what we're talking about? Do we need to reconsider the notion of STEAM and actually talk about transdisciplinarity? What is the role of the more than human? And what kind of spaces, places, curriculums, planning all go into what this new perspective, potentially, of education could be, and the importance of that for our future generation, particularly post-pandemic. It's been really fascinating, Carolyn. I've really enjoyed that conversation.
Good.
Thank you so much for
No problem. I've enjoyed
me.
it too.
It's been really wonderful, and I will leave information of your biography and things like that when we post this video, so people can go and check out some of your work and carry on some of their reading if they're interested in post-humanism. But thank you so much, Carolyn, for joining me today.
It's been great. Thank you very much.